Good evening and welcome to the first JIVE stream on my new dedicated channel for JIVE Talks. This is a JIVE Talk today about the mysterious Tarim mummies which were found by British archaeologists originally up in the Xinjiang province of China on the fringes of the Tarim Basin, and which date over a period of over 2,000 years of the tradition. And I made that big video about it called White Mummies of China or something like that, Blonde Mummies of China, over a year ago now, or nearly 2 years ago. And in that video I looked at the evidence for Indo-European people around the Tarim Basin to explain, and also of Indo-European languages spoken in the Tarim Basin in medieval times, to speculate on the identity of these prehistoric Bronze Age mummies, which appear to be white people. But I was wrong in my speculations. I surprised to find that, but the actual results from a new paper combined collaborative paper with members of Max Planck Institute in Leipzig in Germany, which has got Johannes Krauss is involved, but most of the authors are Chinese, so it appears to be primarily a Chinese paper. And I'll talk today about what those results are and how they differ from what I thought was going to be. I'm very sorry about the delay, 8 minutes late, but it was because my streaming software OBS had a glitch problem and I couldn't get the camera to recognize. I fixed that, but now it still won't recognize my display capture, so I can't show you any of the images that I prepared of the mummies and of the maps of the places I'm talking about and of the data and figures from the paper, which is a shame because I think that would have helped everybody to understand it. But I did a blog post on the Survive the Jive blog about the whole thing, and you can see there some images which you might find useful. Basically, the Tarim Basin is an inland sea, and it's all sandy. There's nothing there that you can live off, but there were some oases around the different rivers because it's surrounded by mountainous regions, including the Palmyra Mountains to the west. 1 second. The Tarim Basin people in medieval times spoke Tocharian, which is one of the most divergent and therefore ancient Indo-European languages. However, it is not attested any earlier than medieval China. So there's this huge gap of thousands of years when it's presumed to have broken off. And the obvious origin for Tocharian, in fact the only plausible origin for Tocharian, is the Afanasyevo culture, which is basically a 100% Yamnaya population, literally Yamnaya, who went all the way thousands of miles to the Altai. And some of them, originally, you can see like they remained 100% pure Yamnaya, even all that far distance into Asia. However, some of them, they went into the Zungarian Basin. And that's literally just a hop, skip and a jump north of the Tarim Basin. There's a ridge of mountains separating it, but you can actually go around them. It's very close. And as I said in my video on the subject, I thought that the Afanasyevo people would have come into Tarim and brought Tocharian languages there. I still think that's true. And they've got, from this new paper, a lot of samples of ancient Zungarian people, and they are Indo-Europeans, and they probably spoke Tocharian. So that hasn't changed. So there are the Zungarian people just north of the Tarim Basin. But they're not 100% Yamnaya anymore. Some of them also have mixture from Western Siberian hunter-gatherers, which is also interesting because this isn't anywhere near Western Siberia. This is still quite a long way from that. But both the Indo-Europeans, Yamnaya, Kordovere, Afanasyevo, and Western Siberian hunter-gatherers are related because they both descend from ancient North Eurasians, this ancient mysterious population who are ancestral to many peoples today, mainly Northern Europeans and Siberian peoples, but also to a lesser extent the Ainu of Japan, and to some significant degree Native Americans. So the other people, Indo-European people near to the Tarim Basin, who I thought may have had something to do with why there were blonde-haired white mummies, were the Andronovo culture, which is a population of white people who migrated from northwestern Europe into Central Asia. And they are the origin of the Indo-Iranic languages. So I presume maybe they would be responsible for Iranic languages, Tocharian languages, somehow mixed together. Those peoples would have, two different Indo-European peoples would have mixed together in that region. And that complicated process was what I imagine would explain all the history of Europoid and people and semi-Europoid peoples in the Tarim Basin. However, I was in for a surprise because the Tarim Basin people are not Andronovo people, nor are they Afanasyevo people. They turn out to be predominantly Western Siberian hunter-gatherers. They are almost 80% ancient North Eurasian. And that's surprising because these mummies come from the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is a long, long bloody time after ancient North Eurasians existed. Really quite surprising. So the oldest samples they got are the Dzungarian Afanasyevo culture ones, which are the very oldest of those are 3000 BC, so 5,000 years old-ish. You're talking about contemporary of Yamnaya, and they're mostly the same as Yamnaya, but with a little bit of DNA probably from mixing with the Tarim people. The Tarim people don't seem to have mixed with Afanasyevo. The earliest ones they've got 13 Tarim mummies in this. They date between 2100 and 1700 BC. So that's basically the earliest stage of the tradition of Tarim mummies. So they got the oldest ones, which is probably the most interesting because that's, the start of it. But in this case, that's not good enough because there's almost 2,000 years more time of Tarim mummies that we have. They exist. They're in China, and they could have sampled them, but they didn't. And those are obviously, that's when the interesting thing happened when the Indo-European integration happened. And those later ones are where we start seeing things like tattoos and Scythian influence, clear Scythian interactions. So there were definitely interactions with Iranic people, or either of the Andronovo culture or later on with the Scythians, or both. And they definitely also had Tocharian interactions with the Afanasyevo because we know that from the language in medieval times. So I don't take either of those claims back that I made in that video. I do believe that the later Tarim mummies were Indo-European people and had Indo-European DNA from their very close neighbours. But the Bronze Age ones, the earliest ones, such as Lulan Lady, do not have any European DNA. They do have Proto-European DNA from ancient North Eurasians. And that, the paper says, is why they look Western, why they look like Caucasians or Western Eurasians or whatever you want to call them, white people. They have hair ranging from brown to blonde, very European traits. Their skin looks white. Interestingly, the DNA shows they don't have the genes for light skin that are associated with white people. Kind of like Cheddar Man doesn't have the genes associated with light skin, but we have the mummy and the skin you can see is very much white. So just because you don't have the genes for light skin that Europeans have, that doesn't mean that an ancient population doesn't have light skin. That's very interesting. The other thing that we can see, and the paper makes it clear, that this people have heavily influenced by Indo-European steppe pastoralists from their neighbours, even though they don't seem to have mixed with them, because they eat dairy and farm herd animals like their steppe neighbours. Now, they must have they're 100%, all of them are lactose intolerant. But they have evidence of kefir, like some kind of fermented milks, which is what, their neighbours in the Afanasyevo culture and the Dzungarian basin were drinking. And they have clear evidence that they'd started the process of mixing, well, not their blood, not mixing their blood, but culturally interacting with neighbouring peoples. And that's also evident in their burials, and that's why I got thrown off as well in my in the end part of my my video, when I start looking at the burial customs and showing evidence of influence from Indo-European cultures. The paper says something like, we shouldn't always assume like archaeological evidence of cultural interactions is evidence of genetic flow. Well, okay, you're right. We shouldn't always assume that. But that's not really... I think in that case it's true that that these people are pure... the Tarim Basin was a pure homogeneous population that didn't mix with outsiders. But in the time period that they looked up until 1700 BC. But the following 1900 years or whatever of that burial tradition in Tarim, they didn't even look at. That's a huge amount of time. And that's a very important amount of time with a lot of changes happening in the region. So they can't say that with any conclusive, anything. They need to look on further. And I think that's a bit disappointing that they didn't get more. So what is the most surprising thing of all is the fact that they are 80% ancient North Eurasian, or whether it was 70 or 80%. That's really weird, because ancient North Eurasians were an Ice Age population, and they seem to have just dissipated and mixed into other populations in the Paleolithic, and no one with anyone near that high would be thought to exist at that time. The Yamnaya and corded ware ancestors that we have were quite heavily ancient North Eurasian, but not as much as this. So these people are even more ancient North Eurasian, and their lifestyle is utterly different from that of a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. So somehow very large, robust mammoth hunters ended up living in a very horrible sandy desert, sometimes eating vultures and lizards to survive. But because they chose to do that, they are basically the only ones of their race to survive into the Bronze Age. Like an almost mythical ancient prehistoric race that managed to survive in this tiny, horrible place. And the other thing that shows is these people don't have any European DNA. But when we look at their skulls, we see this is the skull of a white person. When we look at their mummies with their colourful hair, and their tall bodies, they're robust featured skulls like a white person, and they've got coloured hair like white people. The obvious assumption that all anthropologists and scientists made was that these are white people, but they don't have European ancestry. The only thing they have in common with Europeans is ancient North Eurasian ancestry. Some people have speculated, what did ancient North Eurasians look like? Some people say they must have black skin. Some people say they must have looked like Chinese people for some reason. Well, they obviously didn't, because we can look today at who descends from ancient North Eurasians. Well, you got Europeans, you got Native Americans, and you got certain like Siberian peoples. The highest rates of it are in like Udmurts and Kets and people like that. And you've got the Ainu in Japan have a smaller amount, but some amount. Now, what do these cultures all have in common phenotypically? Now, some of them have East Asian features, but all the ones that have East Asian features, whether it be some of the Ainu and some of the Native Americans, also have East Asian DNA. But the ones who don't have Eastern Asian DNA don't have East Asian features. But all of them exhibit some Europoid features. All of them. And the only DNA they have in common is from ancient North Eurasians. And now we find the mummies of these ancient people have somehow preserved into the Bronze Age as a refugia, and they look like white people. Well, we can only conclude that the ancient North Eurasians were Proto-Europeans. They were Proto-Europoids, and they carried many of the traits associated with Europeans, such as coloured hair and tall bodies and those kind of skull shapes and eye shapes. You know, most Ainu look Oriental, but some of them look more Occidental with, more round eyes and things. So that's a really fascinating insight into who the ancient North Eurasians were. They were not, as some people fantasize, para-Mongoloids. I heard someone use that absurd expression. So the other person who's got quite a lot of ancient North Eurasian DNA is an ancient Native American skeleton called Kennewick Man. And when people found the skeleton, they said, this is a European man. And it caused a stir with certain people, like the eminent pagan priest, Stephen McNallen, to lead campaigns saying this is, evidence of Europeans in America at an early date. He can be forgiven for that mistake. Kennewick Man was not a European. But the claim that the skull was European was very reasonable because it looked like a European man's skull, and the reconstructions of Kennewick Man suitably looked European. And some people tried to use the Solutrean hypothesis as an explanation for that, although the Solutrean hypothesis is not very plausible. But now we don't need the Solutrean hypothesis to explain it. We know that Kennewick Man had ancient North Eurasian DNA, as all Native Americans do, but obviously the phenotypes associated with the ancient North Eurasians were more prominent in days gone by among Native Americans. So I find that all very interesting, and that's something that hasn't really been focused on enough in the paper, which is probably one of the most interesting things. What colour were the early Tarim Basin people's eyes? I don't know. Some people have depicted them as having blue eyes and green eyes, and some newspapers have reported that they have blue eyes, but that was even before genetic testing was available. So I don't know why that anyone said that. I don't know what colour eyes they have, and I don't think we can know that. I would say in all probability they had brown eyes, because that's the general colour of human eyes, with some very, very few exceptions in history. And it does seem that blue eyes don't really exist anywhere before the Mesolithic. But that hasn't been looked at yet. Someone says, were the A&E in America before mixing? No. The ancient ancestors of Native Americans were mixed with East Asians before crossing over into America. So all Native Americans have always had East Asian DNA. But obviously that mix, the mix, the phenotype might have changed over time. I mean, they crossed over like 20,000 years ago or something like that, 10,000 years ago. Another problem with the paper is that it doesn't address the conflicting information with previous papers. Some have got the idea that some claimed that some of the mummies had R1A haplogroup, and that was a stumbling block I was trying to explain in my video on the subject, because if the mummies had R1A, then they had to be descended from corded ware people, and that means they can't have been Afanasiovo Tocharians, and that's why I said they must more likely have been ancient Iranic Andronovo culture. But these mummies, I don't think they're definitely not Andronovo culture, and there's no plausible explanation for why they would have R1A, because no Western Siberian hunter-gatherers had R1A as far as we can tell, and R1A wouldn't have existed among ancient North Eurasians because it hadn't evolved yet. It's more recent. R1A, R was around up there back then, but not R1A as far as I'm aware. So that's why I just made this. I had to be Andronovo, but that leaves a question of how can they have had R1A? Well, Davidsky at Eurasians has said that the explanation is that paper that made the claim they have R1A was simply wrong, and that the claim was based on PCA comparisons, and that would somehow make the prediction for their haplogroups not plausible. I don't know enough to say anything more about that, but it is a problem. Another explanation could be that later mummies do have R1A. I can't remember which ones were tested. The dating on which mummies were claimed to have R1A. But if they were after 1700 BC, then maybe that's because they'd already started intermixing with Andronovo people who all carried R1A, and that would explain it perfectly. This paper is very interesting and changes our view of the Tarim Basin people so entirely, which is fantastic. But at the same time, it also falls short of answering some of the big questions that really everyone wants to answered about the Tarim Basin. When did Tocharian enter? They don't tell us. When did these R1A haplogroups enter the Tarim Basin? They don't tell us. So we're not given any answers to these questions that must still be asked, because we know those things did occur. Tocharian languages did enter. European people did enter the region. But now we just know this fascinating fact that Proto-European people were there even earlier. Now, what on earth do we imagine the steppe herders made of these giant blonde-haired Western Siberian hunter-gatherers who had survived in the desert? And obviously they interacted, and the Tarim people borrowed culturally from the Indo-Europeans before mixing for hundreds of years, before they started to mix thoroughly. That's very interesting to think about. How did those interactions come about? How did they end up giving ruminants to the Tarim people? What did they trade for? What were the Tarim people offering that was useful to the Indo-Europeans, that they would give them sheep and cows or whatever they wanted, goats? I find that all quite interesting to think about. Haven't given it enough thought yet. But the Dzungarian samples of Afanasyevo, as I said, aren't pure Yamnaya. They have started to mix with natives of the region already. But I think that the paper overinflates the level of that mixing, because it has conflated the A&E of one with the A&E of the other, since both of them share so much ancient North Eurasian ancestry. So I've seen some people challenge the models of admixture that the paper presents about that, but obviously the mixing has occurred by that ancient time. Are ancient North Eurasians closer to East Asians or Europeans? They're so archaic. I think they're closer genetically to Europeans. But they're so archaic that it's hard to say, because they're ancestral to so many people. And modern populations are so divergent. Is R1A basically Aryan? R1A is... There are many subclades of R1A. The Andronovo one, which came out of Fat Yanovo... Its oldest example is in Fat Yanovo. And it must have gone into Asia and spread via Sintashta and Andronovo and into Iran and into India. That one you can call Aryan. But other R1A haplogroups are more associated with Europe, and therefore they would be more properly called Slavic or Baltic if you wanted to ascribe them to a ethnic group. Someone else says... someone just saying silly things. Pedantic. Everyone wants to try to redefine things. So yeah, DNA testing could show the colour of their eyes, yes, but they haven't done, as far as I know, didn't do a phenotype prediction. But as we've said, the phenotype of skin colour is off. Like, I think that the predictions of ancient skin colour have not been as accurate as we thought, perhaps, because now we can see with the mummies that they aren't dark-skinned. So, I don't know. they do have the genes associated with dark skin like East Asians do. But then again, not all East Asians have particularly dark skin, in my opinion. So, yeah, Udmurts have a lot of red hair, someone's pointing out. And Udmurts are probably one of the closest related of all peoples to these Tarim people and to ancient North Eurasians. So some Finnic peoples, Sami, quite closely related. Udmurts, quite closely related. Ket, I know, are strongly related to ancient North Eurasians. But you're basically talking about a sort of lot of these populations today which have bits of East Asian ancestry or Siberian ancestry. Europeans with the mixture of things kind of end up plotting quite close to them. The Batai culture also seem to have a strong genetic affinity with the Tarim people. And that's quite interesting, because people often ask me, what did the Batai look like? I said, I don't really know. But maybe we should consider the possibility that the Batai looked a bit like the Tarim people. I had assumed the Batai would have looked more Asiatic. But who knows? That's interesting to consider as well. The funny thing is, the scientists don't necessarily consider phenotype a very interesting ancient phenotype and a very interesting area of inquiry, or at least they pretend they don't. But the average person who isn't a scientist, who dabbles in population genetics and archaeogenetics, seems obsessed with phenotype, and they never want to know anything except eye and hair color. It seems like the only thing anyone asks. So given that that's such an area of interest in the general public, you'd think that they would make a concession to popular interest and actually just tell people what they thought the eye color was. But yeah, someone remember the skulls, the elongated skulls and red hair. I do think that the skulls in Peru, I don't like it when people try and claim that they're white, or that I've seen people claim that they were like somehow connected to the Caucasus, because someone erroneously claims that the Caucasus had a tradition of skull modification. It's not the Caucasus that had, that's the steppe. That people on the steppe from quite early dates, even going right back, Indo-Europeans, did use traditions of skull modification, and also some of the people later on in the Bronze Age around China, like the Yuezhi, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Iranic peoples did also have this skull modification where they bound the skulls of babies so they'd be mutant. And obviously you've seen similar things in other cultures that are completely unrelated to the steppe. And one of those is in Peru, they had skull modification. That doesn't mean they come from the steppe. And then they point out that some of the mummies apparently appear to have red hair, these Peruvian ones. And then they say that must be a white person. But not so, because there's possibility for other cultures to have developed coloured hair without them being white people. I don't believe there were white people in Peru. I think it's quite likely that an ancient North Eurasian phenotype of red hair survived among some Native American populations, and that might be why some of them appeared more like Europeans than others. Yes. May I know what this person actually studying? I'm not. I'm studying at the moment. I'm studying population genetics, and I study mainly ancient religions. If you mean what am I a student? I'm not a student at a university. I finished that 9 years ago. I studied medieval history, and I focus on ancient religion, of pagan religions. So my main interest is pagan religions, but you can't know about religion without knowing about people, and you can't know about people without knowing about archaeology. And in the 21st century, if you're an archaeologist and you don't look at population genetics, then you're not doing your job properly, because population genetics is the main area of massive development and advance in archaeology. So archaeogenetics is vital. So that's why I devote a lot of my attention to archaeogenetics, because it helps me understand so much of related topics. But what some laymen don't understand is that it's not a case of you go to university and then you've got your knowledge and you just hold it in your brain and then dispense it for the rest of your life. Learning is an ongoing process. You continue to learn and study every day. So every day I'm studying all my life, and you don't learn less after university than during university. You continue to learn as long as you continue reading. Did Genghis Khan have red hair and blue-green eyes? I've never heard that he did from any reliable source, but he did have Scythian ancestry. All the Mongols did have Scythian ancestry, and the Scythians had Andronovo ancestry, and the Andronovo were originally white Europeans. So it's possible that he had some Europoid features, but he certainly wasn't white. He would have been an Asian-looking man, a Mongolian. He was a Mongolian. No doubt about that. There's no justifiable reason for anyone to claim that Genghis Khan was anything but a Mongolian. What else can I say about the new paper? Another thing is that the material culture of the Tarim people, which I didn't talk about so much in my video, perhaps because I thought it would complicate issues and move away from the overall thesis, which was talking about the Indo-European aspects of the burials. But a lot of the things in their culture don't appear to be Indo-European and have strong resemblances to non-Indo-European cultures, such as the Mansi and the Ket, who I mentioned, who have a lot of ancient North Eurasian ancestry. And these are like Siberian peoples who have certain kinds of idols, wooden idols. And of course, Indo-Europeans also made wooden idols, but there's something about this style of idol that is particularly similar. And I put them on my blog, you can compare. They remind me very much of the Sugir idol, which was made by Eastern hunter-gatherers. And of course, Eastern hunter-gatherers are mostly just ancient North Eurasian. They're the Mesolithic descendants of ancient North Eurasians. And the Eastern hunter-gatherers are the ancestors of Indo-Europeans, and also of many Siberian peoples, Finnic peoples and things. So maybe they both took from this in different ways. The other people who have very similar idols are the Kalash in Afghanistan, in Nuristan. And these Nuristani people have these idols that they speak an Indo-European language and they follow an Indo-European religion, the Kalash. It's a form of archaic Hinduism, closer to the Vedic religion than what's generally practiced in India. And they have quite elevated levels of Andronovo ancestry relative to people from India. And obviously some of the Kalash people even look like whites. Most of them don't, but some do. But their idols kind of look a bit like Siberian idols, and maybe that's because they had influence from not just from an Indo-European culture, but maybe from some Western Siberian hunter-gatherer culture that was in the region. So maybe the Andronovo culture borrowed from Siberian peoples and brought Siberian features into the Himalayas and more southern regions of Asia. Don't know, pretty speculative, but it is interesting to note that the material cultural similarities now, with the hindsight of knowing that these people are basically Siberians living in this area. So I'm going to say again, they only took these 13 Tarim mummies. It's a good sample size. That's really good. And they're from the oldest time, which is also good, because I would rather, if they said they were only going to take them from the oldest or the youngest time, I would have said better to take them from the oldest. So they did that. But even better would have been to just spread them out more evenly over the entire period of Tarim, but instead of concentrating on the oldest time. Because there's only 400 years, which they've taken samples from, and then the following 1900 years, which they didn't, which is, you don't have to be a scientist or a historian to know that that is not a representative sample for the entire duration of the Tarim people. I'd say it's a good sample for, it's good, it's perfectly big enough to represent those first 400 years, and that is not necessary really to do another massive study on the early Tarim mummies, but their autosomal DNA anyway, but other things could be looked at, such as the haplogroups. But the younger stuff needs to be looked at, and I reckon Chechen Man, who was reconstructed for my video, the guy with the golden stuff written around and the trousers. So he's wearing trousers, which is a horse culture thing. I'm pretty sure trousers might have been invented by Iranic people, or like it's certainly one early Indo-European people, whether it was Proto-Indo-Europeans or Proto-Indo-Iranics. It's someone on the steppe for horse riding. Tattooing does seem to be a major feature of Indo-European cultures. We see it in the catacomb culture on their fingers. We see it in the Scythian peoples. We see it in later cultures. I'm going to guess that the fact that the Tarim mummies start to get tattooed later on, as far as I can see. I don't think the earlier ones are tattooed. Chechen Man and some of his women tattooed, I reckon, and he's from about 1000 BC, so that's about 700 years after the youngest of the mummies that's been sampled here. I reckon Chechen Man's an Indo-European. I still think he is, but he probably has a mix of. He probably has some DNA from these Tarim, earlier Tarim people, you know. So I think there's probably some continuity. But it's interesting to know. It would be interesting to know, when did the Indo-Europeans start to replace the genetics of the original Tarim people, and how long did that process take? And was it a violent process, or was it just a gradual, peaceful process? I doubt the Chinese noticed, because to them it would just look like all just different barbarians with light hair and light skin and high noses and brows and things like that, drinking milk and being smelly, and probably smoking cannabis, as has been proven. The young high shaman who I talked about in my cannabis video from Tarim, I also believe he was a Indo-European. So he's wearing trousers as well, and his material culture seems to be very connected with people out on the steppe. So I just believe he is probably going to be Indo-European. But then I can't say for sure, because these early Tarim people don't have any Indo-European DNA, but they do have strong cultural influences from the Indo-Europeans. So you can't go on the archaeology alone to tell the blood. So yeah, I don't know. Wasn't Otzi tattooed as well? Yes, but Otzi just had like some dots, like a couple of dots on him and stuff. It's not the same thing. Like if you see the finger bones of the catacomb culture, you can see like they've been tattooed so heavily that they've gone through and tattooed the bones and patterns, like not just dots, like complicated patterns. And then you see those exact same kinds of patterns as you see in catacomb culture. By the way, the catacomb culture is the successor of the Yamnaya culture, and it's probably the origin of the Greek language. That same style of tattooing is seen on the hands of a woman from the Tarim Basin, one of the mummies from the Tarim Basin. So I think that kind of tattooing could be evidence of steppe influence. Certainly is evidence of steppe influence in some cases, but in the Tarim Basin, I'm going to say it definitely is steppe influence. But whether it is also evidence of steppe ancestry, I'm going to be a bit more cautious to say it is, because we can see the possibility that it isn't. But I still maintain that at some point the process of Indo-Europeanization of the blood and not just the culture occurred. And I don't believe, as the paper seems to imply, that, that pots are never people kind of thing. Because what's been shown by ancient DNA studies in the last 5 years is that pots very frequently are people. In fact, they seem almost always to be people. And if they're not people, they might be, at one point, they probably soon will be people later. The pots can precede the people. Anyway. Someone says R1b was more present in the old European cultures. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't at all. There was a very rare branch of R1b in the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe, which is pretty much dead now. It's been found, I think, in one Western hunter-gatherer. It's not found in the Neolithic at all. It's not found in Minoans at all, as far as I'm aware. Or the Egyptians only get it after interacting with people who had interacted with Indo-Europeans. So the Egyptians, it doesn't come from Egypt. It doesn't come from a Neolithic population in the Near East. It comes from it's spread mainly by Indo-Europeans. And R1a is not more present in Celts at all. That's not true. So Hyperborean Archives has made two very false statements, demonstrably false. Why didn't the early to mid-Christians just destroy Stonehenge for building materials? That's a very interesting question. Because it's not in an area with a lot of stone, so it could be useful for stone. It might be that they just sort of had a general fear and reverence of the area. The Anglo-Saxons and Celts, Christians, didn't build out of stone anyway. They built out of wood, and that's why not very few of their churches survive. What Anglo-Saxon churches do survive in England are those that were then reused and repurposed by the Normans. It's after the Norman conquest you start to see more stone churches appear. But even under the Normans and throughout English history, the majority of buildings have not been built with stone. Only more grand ones get built with stone. Because there's an abundance of other cheaper and easier building materials, especially in Wiltshire. Yeah, I wouldn't think it was a great place to build with stone. But there could be some ancient superstitions about moving them or something. And also there was some medieval myths about Merlin making it and stuff. So I think people, or the devil even having done something to it. So maybe they were afraid of it. How's the super cold? Someone asks. Thank you for asking. Yes, I'm actually still recovering. I've had very, very strange sickness. Yeah, I caught it from my wife, and I caught it from some friends, and my wife didn't get that sick. My son and I got very sick, and it took I'd say over a week to get over it. And that's not happened to me ever before, and I can't really explain why. It just seemed very strange, but it was quite debilitating, and I was not able even to. I had to just go to bed a lot in the daytime and sleep. But I'm all right now. I'm not dead. Someone said I was dead. Yes, people are getting angry with Hyperborean Archives for talking nonsense. I think he's done some independent reading. I think you've been reading the wrong things that are wrong. Anything else I can say about this paper? probably lots I forgot to say. Yeah, other people, Siberia, Batai had some close affinity. Some of the Afanasieva have some affinity because they've got that mixture. Yeah, I'd like to see. I mean, no one's done reconstructions of ancient North Eurasians yet because there haven't been decent. I don't think there's any skulls. There's only been like bits of bones or something. Not enough. Only fragmentary. I think ancient North Eurasians are originally only existed as what was called a ghost population because of the presence of their DNA in so many populations. It was theorized by geneticists that they existed. And then they got one sample, Malta boy, but I don't think that's good enough that you could do a reconstruction of it. Afontova Gora, I don't know how to pronounce it. Afontova Gora 3 is often used as a proxy for ancient North Eurasians as well, that sample. But yeah, maybe someone could do a reconstruction, not of a specific skull, but just as a general idea. But then it becomes a bit fantasy and arbitrary without an actual skull to go on. But I imagine they would look a bit like the Kennewick Man reconstruction, to be honest. I expect that is quite similar to what they look like. Maybe some of them, I expect some of them were blonde as well because they had the genes for blonde hair, and that we know that that's where it comes from. Yeah. Someone says, I heard red hair is from mutated genes. Every gene is from a mutated gene. Every person is a mutant. Every phenotype is a mutation. Everything is a mutation. So when some like low IQ people say, y'all are mutants, like because a certain phenotypical trait was derived from a mutation. Every phenotypical trait comes from a mutation. It's just really low IQ people say that. Someone's asking me about what language the Tarim mummies spoke. I don't care to speculate. I don't know. I certainly don't know. Someone's asked me about the mushroom video. You are an archaeologist of a different kind. R1A is associated with the corded ware culture. So is R1B. Pretty much, someone's saying like R1. This is an old haplogroup argument from the 90s where people say, which one was the Indo-Europeans, R1B or R1A? Those days are over. We don't have that question anymore. The R1A and R1B that are extant in Europe now are both from the same population of corded ware people. Yamnaya R1B is barely found very much in Europe, actually. The R1B that Western Europeans have, we know from my last live stream, I explained this, comes from early corded ware. Also, many of the Q haplogroups that were thought to be like Siberian, now we know that there's Q also in early Indo-Europeans. So there's also an I2 as well. So not all I2 in Europe comes from Western hunter-gatherers. Some comes from Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya specifically. But the corded ware, the majority of steppe ancestry in Europe and Asia, well, in Europeans and Indo-Iranians, comes from the corded ware culture, not from anyone else. That's where all the R1A comes from, whether it be the Aryan or the Slavic. That's where the R1B of Britain and Spain comes from, the Western European R1B comes from. That's where it comes from. So now we should look to corded ware, and as the ancestral, the Indo-European group of the modern world. It is, and not Yamnaya. And actually, interesting, a colleague of mine did a new map of steppe DNA, but not using Yamnaya DNA, using the early corded ware sample from the recent paper. And it's a woman, it doesn't make a difference. But anyway, using her DNA. And the funny thing you see is that the Northwest Atlantic regions are the highest in the world. So you're talking Ireland, Norway, Holland, there's parts of Scotland. That's the most Indo-European part of the entire world. If you use the actual source of Indo-European DNA and not a random Yamnaya proxy, then that is, which is going to upset a lot of people who hate Western Europeans and Northern Europeans for some reason. But good. It's good to see them. It's good to see them get upset because they're stupid. How much time do you spend studying? I work for 8 hours a day. Not all of that is studying, but sometimes in my free time I read. So some of my free time might be spent studying. I certainly don't spend 12 hours a day studying. I don't think so. Weren't Otzi's tattoos like acupuncture points? Someone asked. Yeah, they did look like that. And that's interesting because some Native American cultures in North America do use tattooing in a medical, or medical might not be the word, but in a healing ritual. So the process of the tattooing is part of the healing ritual. So he might have had these tattoos as a cure for something. You have to remember all different ways. What we see something, a tattoo, and think, or ornament. But it might not have been perceived that way at the time. It might have been something quite different. Ancient North Eurasians are the true Proto-Indo-Europeans. Well, they're more than Proto-Indo-Europeans, aren't they? Because they're Proto-Europeans, and they're also Proto-Native Americans. So they're too archaic to be called Proto-Indo-Europeans. And also, by the way, Proto-Indo-European refers to a language which they did not speak because it didn't exist yet in the Ice Age. So they're not Proto-Indo-Europeans. They are, I would say they're Proto-Europoid in the anthropological sense. But they're also ancestral to many other non-European peoples. How accurate is My True Ancestry? My True Ancestry is misleading because it just tells you who you plot like on their PCA. It doesn't tell you have... If it says Viking, it doesn't mean you got Viking ancestry. If it says Scythian, that does not mean you have Scythian ancestry. I keep telling people this. Everyone keeps emailing me telling me they're a Scythian because they saw it in My True Ancestry. You are not a Scythian. It just means you plot like a Scythian, which isn't surprising because Scythians were a mongrel group of all sorts. You've got some in the Balkans who have quite a significant Southern European admixture. You've got some in the East who've got significant Oriental admixture. You've got some that plot like more like Northeastern Europeans. You've got all sorts of different people who are Scythians, and anyone can plot like them without having any ancestry from them, because that's how a PCA works. Anyway, they just capitalize on the very strong demand people have to know who their ancient ancestors were. And I will tell you that just because you plot like an ancient population doesn't mean you have ancestry from them. It does. You could do, but not necessarily. You need to look with a bit more detail. But if you are a German, then you shouldn't think that in any way, or Britain, or a Swede, or a Pole, you don't have to look at your DNA to know about your ancient ancestry, because when you're going that far back, your own DNA becomes irrelevant. your DNA test is just to find out about your recent ancestry. Ancient ancestry is not that different from one Englishman to another Englishman. Their ancient ancestry is the same. When you go back that far, they share the same ancestors. But when you're looking at modern ancestors, then it's different. So, yeah, for if you just want to know about your ancient DNA, don't actually get a DNA test. Just save your money and just research the ancient DNA of your nation, because you'll find it out that way, and you don't have to spend £100 on a DNA test. So, which doesn't tell you that anyway. Okay, I'm starting to lose my voice a bit now, so I'll wish you all a very good night, and I hope you enjoyed my recent films about cannabis and Yamnaya, and I'll try and do more streams on this new channel. I have an upcoming video about the god Thor in British folklore, and why he survives and where he survives in the folklore of Britain. That will be ready quite soon, so you have that to look forward to. Anyway, I hope you found this stream about the ancient North Eurasians interesting. Remember, this is not on the Survive the Jive channel that you're watching now. You're watching the JIVE Talks channel, and you might not be subscribed to it. So make sure you go and click subscribe right now, because all my streams in future will be on this channel and not on the Survive the Jive channel. So with that, I bid you good night, and thank you very much for watching.